It's with special pleasure that I introduce Professor Yaneer Bar-Yam. He's the founder of the New England Complex Systems Institute, which is a growing and dynamic organization that is in many respects parallel with and convergent with the work in the system sciences. He has his PhD from MIT in physics. He was an associate professor of engineering at Boston University and is an associate in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology at Harvard University currently. He's also the author of the textbook on the dynamics of complex systems, which is the theme for today, so what could be a more perfect meshing of interests and speakers, themes and speakers, I should say. And he's also the editor of 3 books and the author of 80 professional articles on the subject of complexity. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Bar-Yam.
Good morning. Is the mic okay? This is the first time that I've saddled myself with this technology, so you will bear with me as we experiment with it. Today I'm going to talk to you about fundamentals of complex systems on the one hand, in one part of the talk, and then I'm going to talk about an application, if you will, a case study, to thinking about human civilization in entirety. Peter has set things up so that the questions are going to be over a longer period of time than the talk itself, but it will be delayed until lunchtime. If there are a couple of questions during the talk, I hope to be able to take them, but you will bear with the separation as I will have to as well. We're going to run into some misplacement. We transferred the computer, the file from one computer to another. So this is supposed to be pointing to the 2, but things are a little bit shifted. There are 3 approaches to thinking about complex systems that I like to present. One is, how do interactions give rise to collective patterns of behavior? Another is, how do we formalize and think about descriptions of complex systems in general? And the third is, how do complex systems arise through evolution? I'm going to be talking about the second one today. And so let me start by talking about one of the key aspects of understanding descriptions is thinking about the length of these descriptions. And as I will mention in a moment, this is what we think of as the complexity of a system. Now, what you're looking at here are 2 photographs of living rooms of elderly individuals. This was part of a study that a professor of nursing, Alice Davidson, and myself did to investigate the correlation between the environmental complexity and the psycho-function and well-being of the people that lived there. And there was a correlation, a positive correlation, between the complexity of the environment and the functioning capabilities of the individuals who lived there. Now, what one really would expect is that there would be a natural complexity of the environment which would be appropriate to the individual. If you have too low complexity, it's like sensory deprivation. If you have too high a complexity, it creates confusion. And somewhere in the appropriate regime, it should be sufficiently challenging to create stimulation of psychofunction. That's how to explain it in a qualitative human sense, but in terms of understanding quantitatively the complexity of the environment, this is one of the purposes of this study. And really the purpose of this slide is to say that complexity is a daily property of the environment around us. It's not something which should be restricted to formal analyses. It should be something that we think about all the time in how we experience the world around us. So what is complexity? Well, complexity is an answer to the question, how complex is it? We expect some quantitative answer, it is so complex, or a comparative complexity, how something is more complex than something else. And the answer has something to do with one of two ideas that are being discussed generally. One is the amount of information necessary to describe something, and the other one is the amount of time necessary to create it. Now, of course, I think that these are two are closely related to each other, but I'm going to focus on the first one for this presentation. Aha. We may have more problems. In any case, this is a system. It's supposed to be a slightly different graphic, but that's okay. This is some system. And here we have over here a description of the system. And then the complexity is a measure of this description, i.e. the length of this description. So to describe a system, what we need to do, if we think about what a description is, we need to pick out this system out of some set of possibilities that could be there. So if you have a list of the possible systems, here are m possible systems, this means that you have to have a mapping from systems to descriptions so that you have one description for each of the possible systems. And if you look at, if you use a binary string or a string of English characters, it turns out that the number of possibilities for a string of bits, of course, is exponentially related to the length, but we measure complexity using the length of the string. And it turns out that counting the number of characters and counting the number of bits in a string is about the same. There's about 1 bit per character of English, which means that if you look at the number of meaningful sentences that you can construct of a certain length, roughly speaking, they map 1-to-1 onto the bit strings, and you can think about complexity if you choose to, just as how much English text you would need to describe the system that you're looking at. Now, we can also introduce the problem of inference. One is always concerned that maybe you could write a shorter description and that would contain the same information. And what that means basically is that we could take this short description and infer from it the longer description, and then you use the length of the shortest possible description, and that has the that is within the context of the study of algorithmic complexity. I'm actually not going to focus on this idea. I'm going to focus on the concept of scale instead and talk about issues having to do with scale, as I will explain. So intuitively, to think about scale, imagine a zoom lens on a camera, right? So as you zoom in, you see more details, you see finer scale details of the system. As you zoom out, you see the larger scale, only the larger scale, and not the fine scale details. Now, the scale at which you can see something has something to do with redundancy, robustness, and compressibility. Going back to the notion of algorithmic complexity, it has something also to do with the algorithmic complexity that we were talking about before. But the main point that I want to make is that it's clear from this discussion that complexity depends upon the scale of observation or the level of detail in the description. Now, I want to emphasize something. It's extremely important to think about always the same system. And what I mean by that is that the zoom lens on your camera example is actually deceptive. Because let's think of myself as a system. If you zoom, if you can look at me from far away, you might only see a dot. But if you zoom in closer, you will see details of me, and you will see maybe eventually the tissues and the cells of which I'm composed, and the molecules and the atoms. But in the zoom lens, the aperture is fixed, so you see a smaller and smaller part of me as you zoom in. And what I want to talk about is thinking about the whole system, no matter what scale you're looking at. So if you go actually into the very finest scale, the atomic scale, there is a name that we call this amount of information or the complexity of the system, and that's the entropy. So the complexity is equal to the entropy aside from some units. And what this means is that we understand how long a description there is requires to describe me at the atomic scale. There's a problem with this, however, and the problem is that according to thermodynamics, standard physics, an equilibrium system is a system of highest complexity for a given constituent, for a given set of atoms. What that means particularly, if you take me and you stick me into a blender and you look at the result in a box over here, this uniform liquid is more complex than I am. And this has caused a lot of confusion in thinking about complexity and entropy and so on. So I want to correct this confusion by specifically drawing the complexity as a function of scale. So here are the coarsest scale, the length I'm furthest away from the system. As I go in closer, there'll be more and more details that I'll need to describe. I want to contrast three different kinds of systems. The first is an equilibrium system. So in an equilibrium system, the entropy is very large. The entropy is the information at the finest scale. That's this blue curve, where the entropy is the height of the curve as you get towards zero. Here. Okay, that's the entropy, if you will. So if we go this way, you see that what happens on a large scale is that there's really nothing to describe. It's a homogeneous liquid. Now, on the other hand, if you look at me and you go from large scale, you will see that there's something to describe at a very large scale, and then there's more and more details as I go into the finer and finer scales. The point is that over here, this is lower than that. The entropy of me is lower than the entropy of the equilibrium system. Physics tells us that. But the entropy, the complexity up here is much larger. And so talking about the complexity of two different systems in absolute terms is not really what we talk about when we talk about complexity. We're talking about complexity at different scales. And it turns out that, of course, the way to understand this is that in order to have behavior at a larger scale, I have to give up the complexity at a fine scale. Complexity at fine scale is independence of motion of all of the atoms. I have to describe what each of them are doing. But if they're moving together, or if they're arranged in some patterned way, that will give rise to the structure on the large scale, but it will give up this freedom at the fine scale. Now, if you take that to an extreme, you can take all of my atoms and send them ballistically in one direction. There you would see a very large-scale behavior, but you wouldn't see anything else that would be needed to be described. So let me just say this in a couple of other ways. I will do this quickly. Here is the higher complexity at a larger scale requires coherence or correlation or cooperation or interdependence. Higher complexity on a finer scale corresponds to independence or randomness. Dependencies increase the scale. This is what I told you a moment ago. And here are these three examples written out in a little bit more detail. This is the random case where you have large information at a fine scale. This is the ballistic case where you have a small but large-scale information. And this is the complex systems case where you have progressively more information as you go to finer scale due to progressively greater amount of detail that you're seeing in the system. Here are examples showing that this is valid for physical, biological, and social systems. Here are the three physical systems. You can think about random motion in biological systems of cells in a pond or crowds, and you can think about correlated behaviors or coherent behavior or infection or armies, and complex behaviors of say a human being or other organism, and corporations and social case. And I'll be talking about the social system case in a few moments. Oh, we're losing one picture entirely. Isn't that nice? There's supposed to be over here, you'll have to use your imagination. Right over here, there's supposed to be a nice picture with a tree and a few flowers and an animal, maybe a deer and another tree. And this idea, I'm supposed to describe to you the notion of emergence, right? Which is the idea that you go from the trees to the forest, thinking of the large-scale behavior of the forest with its own dynamics and its own behavior as arising from the fine-scale behavior of trees and animals and other plants and so on and so on. And the point is the following, that if we look at the descriptions at two different scales, we have a finer scale description and a larger scale description. This description is going to be in a different language, if you will, than this description. It is different information. The information that is up here has to do with the relationships that are existing between the behaviors of parts of the system down at this scale. And so this is really a very important part of understanding how emergence works, or emergent behaviors arise. So let me finish this first part of the talk. How much time do I use? 20? Good, perfect. So by going back and looking at the complexity of an individual human being, all right? So this is the complexity profile, say, of me or of one of you. This is the societal scale, which means I came here from Boston yesterday. That's a large-scale motion. That's a behavior that goes up here, okay? However, when I go down to this scale, this is the scale of interactions between human beings, where you can see what I'm saying, my motion of my mouth, my hands, and so on and so on. And that's why I came here and didn't just send you a slide presentation, right? If we can go down further, we see with the details of the cellular scale, a molecular scale, and atomic scale. The point is the following. There is a characteristic complexity which is not just the complexity, it is the complexity of the individual, but it has to do with social interactions. It's the, if you will, the amount of information in a certain amount of time that can be transferred between two human beings because of both of how they move and how they perceive. All right? And that's going to be a complexity at a scale which is characteristically here. So now I'm going to use these ideas to think about human civilization in entirety. All right? So one thing that one can say when we think about society is that people keep talking about how complexity is increasing. There are chairs, guys. If you want to come in and sit in the chairs, that's fine. There's no need to. Okay. The complexity seems to be increasing. Everyone's complaining about how things are changing so quickly, and all of the stuff that you can't figure out is going on. Complexity seems to be increasing. Can we understand that from this perspective? There's also a lot of interdependence. Globalization is talking about how parts of the world become dependent on each other. And these are consistent with the discussion that I gave before of interdependence and complexity, and how that manifests itself in the complexity profile. I'm actually going to postpone talking about this and talk instead about the nature of processes in human organizations that give rise to coordination, and those are the issues of control. And then I'm going to talk about the historical progression motivated by this idea, and finally human civilization as a complex system. So again, interdependence, correlation, and coordination have to do with control in human organizations. That's one of the ways that we talk about it anyway. And I'm going to use examples of military force and factory production to illustrate some of the key ideas. Now, when we think of human organizations, the canonical human organization for several thousand years is the hierarchy. Okay? And what we want to do is to think about a hierarchy in a way that will enable us to understand the nature of what it does. So I'm going to take an idealized hierarchy, which means that there's no lateral communication. You're not allowed to talk to the guy down the hall. You have to talk to your boss, who talks to his boss talks to the other guy's boss, and then eventually it gets down to that guy. That's how hierarchies are supposed to work, right? Okay. So we're going to think about this. And one way to understand this is that hierarchies are designed to enable one person to control the system, right? The process of information going up is a process of filtering. Process of information going down is a process of detailing. And I'm going to talk about this again in a moment. But let's talk about the specific examples of military structure. Well, if we go back and look at early armies, Greek and Roman phalanxes. It's very clear what's happening. This is a system designed to create coherent behaviors. What you do is you take a bunch of individuals, you simplify their individual behavior. Remember, that was a key thing. You simplify the individual behavior, and you make them have a simple, repetitive behavior over a period of time, which makes the scale of the behavior, both in terms of number of people and in terms of repetition, it makes it large. And really, the scale of the impact of these armies was huge. Oop, we don't want to do that. That's fine. So this is just what I said. We have a large-scale impact due to simplifying the individual behavior patterns and making them coherent. Now, in order for this to respond to the environment, you need a very simple hierarchy, not one which has this kind of branching ratio, but one which has many people being directed by a single individual. Everyone go to the right, right? I mean, that's all you need in order to tell an army what to do, by and large. And that creates the coherent behaviors that you need. The hierarchy is there in order to enable response to particular environmental circumstances. Let's talk about a factory. This is a Model T Ford factory. Here you have individuals, which have each one of which has highly repetitive, simplified behaviors. The purpose is to create large-scale impact by having many copies of a single product. At the same time, you have different people doing different behaviors, but those behaviors have to be coordinated. The coordination between these behaviors, you don't want one person making a sewing machine and another person making a car, right? The coordination between these behaviors is the responsibility of the hierarchy. The demands on the hierarchy for this system are much greater than in the military case. There is here a balance between complexity of the product and scale of the impact. It's smaller scale than in the case of the military, but it's also more complex. And the control hierarchy is responsible for the coordination, as I mentioned, and that's a key aspect of how the hierarchy works. So let's now go back and talk about this notion of hierarchy a little bit more carefully. What I want to do is to point out what the hierarchy is doing and also a limitation on the hierarchy. The point is that a hierarchy enables an individual to control only the collective behavior. It's not the responsibility of the hierarchy to control what each person is doing all the time. It's only the collective behaviors, the large-scale behaviors, which need to be controlled by the hierarchy. Now, let's look at what this means. Here is a group of individuals, and here is a group of individuals. According to the idealized hierarchy, the only way that this group and this group know what each other are doing and can coordinate their behaviors is by communication through this channel. Okay? If we want the behavior which is of the scale that includes these guys and these guys and these guys together, if it has to be coordinated, all of that information has to go up through that channel. All right? Now there's a limitation on this channel. This channel is one individual. Remember the complexity of the single individual? Well, that's the limiting complexity of this channel. All right? So what this means is that a hierarchy has a limit on the collective complexity, not on the complexity of looking at the details of what each individual are doing, but looking at the coordinated large-scale behaviors of the entire system. That complexity cannot be greater than the complexity of a single human being. Okay. Well, let's think about the brain for a moment. What if that were true about the brain? Right? If the brain were a hierarchy, well, one neuron would be the CEO of the brain, and the brain would only be able to do collective behaviors which were of the same complexity as a single neuron. Well, that would be pretty limiting, right? At least some of us, we think, have complexities of collective behaviors of our brains, which is more complex than a single neuron. And the nature of a network somehow allows that. So let's go on. I have to go over here, sorry. So here we have our idealized hierarchy. Here we have a network. Now, what is true is that human organizations that we see around us are more characterized by some kind of hybrid. There's not really this kind of strict hierarchy. There are many, many lateral connections. But the idea is that if you wanted to create a very highly complex system in the collective scale, you couldn't do it using this system. You can do it using this, and things intermediate presumably can do something somewhat intermediate. But that limitation is very important. So to progress, I have to make an argument about the nature of historical progress. Now, this is an argument that is somewhat hand-waving, but I think is useful. If we think about the process of human organizations, remember that what I said way back when in the transparency on the pictures about of living rooms was that the complexity of the system has to be matched to the complexity of the environment. If the environmental demands are very complex, the system is not going to survive. The system, on the other hand, has no reason to be much more complex than its environmental demands, so they're going to match roughly. And so the point is the following, however, that part of the environment of human organizations is other human organizations. So if human organizations become more complex, if one of them becomes more complex, that creates a greater demand on this one, and so it has to become more complex in its collective behavior in order to survive. So there suggests that there is a historical process which is an increasing collective complexity of these systems. And again, this transparency doesn't come out quite well. It's supposed to illustrate that in this domain, you progressively go into failure as you go away from having the complexity of the environmental demands be equal to the complexity of behavior. Here you survive, but there's really no reason to be above that. So what you expect is over time, there's a progression that goes like this along the diagonal, which says the complexity of environmental demands is increasing, the complexity of the behavior of organizations is increasing at the same time. And of course, there's a problem. The problem is that there is this barrier, which is the complexity of a single individual. And at the point at which one gets to this point, one expects that what will happen? Well, hierarchical organizations will no longer be able to cut the mustard, right? They won't be able to survive in the context of this kind of environment. So I want to spend a little bit of time and argue that this seems to be roughly what is happening today, but let's make this case very directly. So if we start in history, we will see that hunter-gatherer societies are very simple, small hierarchies. When you go to early civilizations, the complexity, collective complexity is increasing due to the existence of these large-scale coordinated behaviors, which is not just true about military, but also mining and construction. Remember the roads of ancient Rome, and so on. And if we go on to the Industrial Revolution, we see the hierarchy becomes ramified, there become more lateral connections, and the complexity is clearly increasing. When we go to presumably what's happening about now is that we have this hybrid case, and then we presumably will also keep going into some form of a networked system. Let me skip that. I'm almost done. So here's another way to illustrate this. This is not correct. It says complexity on the sideways, but never mind. Here we have the complexity profile, hunter-gatherers, no complexity at a large scale. They weren't moving over scales of many, many kilometers. Early civilizations did that, but they reduced the complexity at a fine scale in order to do that. The Industrial Revolution had an advantage. The strict trade-off that I spoke about between fine scale and large scale didn't apply, and the reason is because of extra energy, coal and oil, which allowed the large scale behaviors to increase, even though the fine scale behaviors increased in complexity as well. And then to this, and presumably to that. So let's talk about recent developments. Many people didn't pay very much attention to this, but during the period of the 1980s, from 1980 to 1990, all of the dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere disappeared. It just went away. What's particularly surprising about this is that most of those transitions were not violent. Some of them were, but most of them were peaceful. Of course, the resulting is not always a full democracy by any means. But the fact that this happened all at once in a period of 10 years is startling given the historical process that came before that. If we look at communism, communism disappeared in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in fact, imploded in entirety in the late 1980s. It was an ahistorical process. There was no precedent for it. Systems don't just say, I give up and go away. All right? Traditionally, there's violent revolutions, and you end up back with central control, whether it's dictatorship or some other form of central control. It was always central control. But in this case, it sort of disappeared. Now, corporations underwent a dramatic transition also. This was the era of the downsizing of the industrial corporations. This was also the era of introduction of things like total quality management and other forms of management change, which really are mechanisms for distributing control. If you think about decentralized systems like markets or the food supply of the city of Toronto, we can understand this problem. Right? The problem of delivering many different kinds of food in different kinds of vehicles at different times to supermarkets and restaurants and so on in a timely fashion is an incredibly complex task. If you think about the food supply in Moscow, which was very few foods, very few places to get food, very poor delivery of on-time products, you see what a centralized system had to resort to in order to enable that process to it all exist, and in fact could not serve its people. I'm really done. Just a moment. So the implication of this is very startling. First of all, we can conclude that the complexity of an individual is larger than it used to be. But what's really important is that the complexity of collective behaviors is larger than an individual behavior. And with that, I would like to go and talk about two more quick points. Let's now talk about some of the original ideas, the ideas of interdependence and correlation. I'm done. Just a moment. The point is, if you look at many different aspects of the world system of human civilization, you realize that something happening over here of many different kinds, military, political, economic, social, is going to affect things happening in many other parts of the world. This is one transparency. There's another one. And of course, down at the bottom, one can put a very big word, the internet, over the last 6 years. And this is after many of the big changes already took place that I talked about in the 1980s. This, of course, increased dramatically the nature of the global complexity and interdependence. And remember, the complexity and interdependence go hand in hand. I wanted to make one political comment. People celebrated the dominance of democracy over communism in this context, but this suggests that there's actually a third option, the complex organism, which is really the one that is arising after the Cold War. So what are the conclusions? First of all, the conclusion is that it is becoming more complex. Society is becoming more complex for individuals. There is a compensation for this. And the compensation for this is like any complex organism. The functioning of the whole is not the functioning of the part. And so the part is actually shielded from the true complexity of the entire system. The second issue is human organizations are changing. That's not a temporary thing. It's probably going to continue going. Central control should not work in a highly complex collective system, and in fact, they must change in order to survive. Let's look at the collective scale. The complexity of collective of civilization is large. How large could it be? Well, I think of the brain. The brain has about 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 12th, 10 to the 13th neurons, depending on who counts them. Well, society has 10 to the 10th people in it, and maybe there are going to be more. But 10 to the 10th is a lot more than 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And in principle, the complexity can be huge. We don't know how large that complexity will eventually reach. The point is that we are now thinking about ourselves, or should now think about ourselves, as part of a more complex organism. There's, again, a benefit to this in that the whole point is that this complex organism can respond effectively to challenges, and those challenges that we are concerned about, environmental challenges and social challenges, may be possible to meet them, and some of them have been met in recent years in ways that were not anticipated. But the point is that the system can adjust to them or can cope with them. On the other hand, and this is the last transparencies, we cannot as individuals expect to control what's going on. We can't even understand it. And this may be frustrating for some CEOs that have to adjust to this, but it of course is also very frustrating to scientists whose whole mission in life is just to understand what's going on in the world around us. And here we are saying that we cannot do that on a fundamental basis, but maybe some modesty is appropriate. On the other hand, this need to understand is not necessary in the complex system. After all, the system is complex because of the entangled functioning of all of the parts, and it is doing a very good job. That's why it's complex, and so it's not necessary in order to do its job. The final message is that while we cannot understand, it is helpful to think about these notions of scale and the scales of behavior of the system and the scales of challenges both individually and collectively. Thank you very much.